Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cops and Cons TV. I just want to welcome everyone into our live show. And today we're going to break down some of the most interesting and important issues in policing and really talk about some of the cases that have been going on in the world of policing across the country. And just like always, as I'm going through this, if you have any questions or comments, one of my favorite things to do is to really have a dialogue and to go back and forth. So if there is something that I say that you disagree with or have a different opinion on, definitely go ahead and put it in the chat so we can have a discussion and a dialogue about some of these cases. And again, please, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Make sure you share it with friends and family. As many people as we can get into these live streams, we would love that as well. So again, my name is Daniel. You can go ahead and follow me over at Police Law News over on YouTube and Substack and TikTok and all of those different places. So it looks like we have a couple regulars in. Just want to say hey to Sergeant George out in California and Shaquille Oatmeal. Looks like we've got someone from Tennessee watching as well, Manhattan and Dallas, Texas as well. Awesome. Well, I just want to welcome everyone in and let's get going. So the first case that we're going to talk about, we actually did cover this a couple weeks ago when it first happened, but really it's been all over the news the last couple weeks. And this is the case in New York City that happened on May 1st with Jordan Neely and Daniel Penny. So the reason why I'm going to talk about it first and lead off with this case is one, there are just a lot of different cases that, there are just some cases and events that inspire, divide, and the entire country. This is just one of those cases, and this is really just like, it's going to set a barometer for the entire culture, for the entire country, on where you fall on this particular case. In short, this is an important case. So I am going to talk about it, and since 2 weeks ago when we first talked about it, there is just a lot more information about this case that's become available, and I'm really curious to see what other people think about this case as well. All right, so this was the case from May 1st of 2023. This happened in New York City. The two individuals involved are Jordan Neely and Daniel Penny. So if you remember, Jordan Neely is a 30-year-old. They like to call him a Michael Jackson impersonator because sometimes he does impersonate Michael Jackson on the subway. Some of the other things that we found out about Mr. Neely is that he's a homeless individual since 2003. He's been arrested 42 times. Some of the most notable, most notorious arrests are back in 2015. He was arrested for trying to kidnap a 7-year-old. He did plead guilty to some type of child abuse charge, and he actually only served 4 months in prison for that particular case. Also, some of the other notable ones, in 2021, so not that long ago, within a 6-month period, he battered 2 different elderly women. There was a 65-year-old woman that he sucker punched, and then a 67-year-old woman that he broke her nose and her orbital bone when he punched her for essentially no reason. On the date of this incident, and again, the other individual, Daniel Penny, he would have no way to know this information. I know that. I get that. But on the date of the incident, I think it is reasonable to want to know on the date of the incident that Mr. Neely did have a warrant out for his arrest for that second case where he bashed up the 67-year-old woman, broke her nose and orbital bone. So yeah, Shaquille O'Meal says yes, absolutely. So he was on the train and he was yelling and screaming. And when you're arrested 40, and I just want to say that, clearing warrants and saving people shouldn't be a crime, but Daniel Penny was charged. Some of my initial thoughts about this case before I get into some of the facts are, it's one of those things where it's like looking at the comments, because I've done about 10 TikTok videos on this case. Instagram, I've talked to just a lot of different, YouTube as well, but I've talked to a lot of different people through the comments on my videos on these cases. And here's what I found. Really, the only men that oppose what Daniel Penny did are those who are so meek and who are so meek that if they were in a situation where they were on a subway where, someone was threatening elderly women, instead of standing up and doing something, they would just look for an excuse to change to a different train car. It seems like that's the category of people who oppose what Daniel Penny did. Also, it's not Daniel Penny's fault that Jordan Neely was allowed to freely stalk the streets in search of completing his psychotic narrative of terrorizing innocent people. The courts, advocates, lawmakers, his family, those people, those groups of people are far more liable and responsible for what happened than Daniel Penny. So on the date of this incident, like he had multiple times, Jordan Neely got on the subway and started screaming and yelling at random people. It got to the point where he was screaming and yelling, and it wasn't just that, he was also threatening people. So there's a factual issue. There's a question of fact about whether or not Jordan Neely was issuing death threats. So was he actually threatening individuals with killing them? Was he saying that? Because, when we look at Daniel Penny's actions here in a couple minutes, I'll get to it. But, if Jordan Neely was just screaming and yelling and ranting and raving, that's one thing. But if he's actively threatening to kill someone, that's a different thing. And I think that we can all recognize this. So the factual question that I think we all have to answer is, was Jordan Neely threatening to kill people? So what evidence do we have about whether or not he was threatening to kill people? Well, he was screaming and yelling on the subway. Here are some of the things that he was yelling. He was yelling on the subway. He was demanding food and water. He took off his jacket and he violently threw his jacket down on the ground. He started pacing back and forth and yelling. He was kind of approaching people but didn't touch anyone. And there were several people, including elderly people, who moved to the other side of the train car in order to get away from Mr. Neely. Some of the things he said are, "I'll hurt anyone on this train. I would kill a motherfucker. I don't care. I'll take a bullet. I'm ready to go back to jail." He then said he would do life. Well, if we take that into account, so the actions of the screaming and the yelling, the throwing down the jacket, the approaching people, and then when you say these things such as, "I would kill a motherfucker, I don't care, I'll take a bullet, and I don't mind doing life," or "I'll go back and do life." I think everyone knows, whether you live in New York City, or not, I think you know that there's really only one crime where people do life in prison for, and that's murder. So given the situation, given the facts of the situation of what happened, I think it's reasonable to believe that not only Daniel Penny, but other individuals on the train had a reasonable belief that Jordan Neely might try to seriously hurt someone or kill someone. Let's see. Angela says he didn't need to die. He is mentally ill. Call the police. Okay, Angela, I appreciate the comment. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that here in a second. So you're on a subway, Angela. So again, I'm not from New York, but I grew up in Chicago. So I grew up driving those. Or I grew up riding those cars all the time. So you have to think about it. It's not, when you're in a subway, there is nowhere to escape. There is nowhere to go. So you're essentially trapped and contained on a subway. And Angela, it's very close quarters. Angela, if they were at like a public park, if they were at a library, I could come up with, if they were at a McDonald's restaurant, I could name 100 different places where if they were, I probably would go down that path with you, because what I'm saying is the individuals who he was screaming at would have an option to leave. They would have an option to go someplace else, right? So, but on a subway car, you're underground in this little fucking container. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. So I think it's a little bit different there. So calling the police when you're trapped, it's like being trapped in an elevator. Go ahead and call the police. They literally can't do anything because you're trapped in a container with someone. So what happened is Daniel Penny and two other individuals, one of them was an African-American man, did subdue and essentially restrain Mr. Neely. Daniel Penny went from behind. He grabbed him, and took him down to the ground. And people call it a submission hold. People call it a blood choke. Some people call it a chokehold. All of these different terms are being thrown about. Now, what I'm going to say is that when you're in a situation like that, and it's a dynamic situation, you're fighting with someone you're trying to subdue someone or hold someone on the subway. The idea that everything is going to go perfect and that the use of force or what you're trying to do is going to work out exactly perfectly and it's going to be just like you were trained to do in a controlled situation, like that is not a reasonable expectation. That's not a reasonable expectation for police officers in the use of force. It never goes as planned. And even if it's legal, it always looks ugly. Same thing with this. So I wouldn't, if Daniel Penny was trying to do some type of a blood choke, which is essentially, and I'm not an MMA person, this isn't my area of expertise, but my understanding is that if you do what's called a blood choke, that isn't cutting off the airway. So essentially, it's meant to put someone to. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure there's people in here who are MMA junkies who know more about this than me. But my understanding is that the type of choke that Daniel Penny, or the type of submission that he was trying to do, so his intent was to essentially to make Jordan Neely pass out, not kill him. That wasn't his intent to kill him. He wanted him to pass out. And it is important to note that Daniel Penny, he was a Marine. He was trained by the military in ground combat submission. So he does have obviously some training in this type of stuff. So as Daniel Penny was doing this, two other individuals, and some of this is on video, so obviously the whole video hasn't been released, but enough of the video, has been released where we do have a pretty good idea of what happened, at least during the submission. And there were two other individuals who weren't telling Daniel Penny, "What are you doing? Stop! You're gonna kill him! What the fuck are you doing?" Like, no one said that. If anything, two other individuals were trying to help. Specifically, there was an African American man who was holding Jordan Neely's hands. I'm guessing so he couldn't reach inside of his pockets for a weapon or anything like that. And then there was another individual who was standing up most of the time. However, a couple of different times he did kind of bend over and he did put his hands on Jordan Neely's kind of like upper back and arms and shoulder area as well. But let's see. Steve Ladner says, "Who in their right mind calls police for anything?" Steve's so funny. All right, so so there was no intent to actually kill, but again, so let me say, so while this is going on again, this isn't like the George Floyd case, meaning when there was the George Floyd case going on and Derek Chauvin did have his knee on or near George Floyd's neck, there were 10, 12 individuals who were screaming and yelling and telling the police officer, Derek Chauvin, to stop what he was doing. Okay, that didn't happen here. If anything, people were happy that Daniel Penny stopped Jordan Neely from doing something dangerous because people on the train were scared. So, unfortunately, it wasn't intended, but Jordan Neely did die. So I hate when people ask the question. So this is a really dishonest question, especially on TikTok. TikTok has the absolute worst comments. I honestly think that our YouTube viewers, the IQ points are about 30 points higher or so than my TikTok followers, because the kind of questions that they ask on TikTok is absolutely ridiculous. They say things like, "So did he deserve to die? Did Jordan Neely deserve to die?" Well, that's such a weird question, and you know what? It's not relevant. First of all, deserving to die, like, what does that mean? I can make an argument that almost no one deserves to die. There are lawful and justified situations that occur where someone in self-defense might kill someone, but the idea of deserve to die, like, that isn't in any police training. That's not in military training. That's not a legal term of art. Deserving to die is not a legal standard, and it's an absolute ridiculous question to ask. People who aren't serious, those are the kinds of questions that they ask when they say, did he deserve to die? So that's a ridiculous question. So obviously there was no intent for Mr. Neely, from Mr. Penny, to kill Mr. Neely, but Mr. Penny did just get charged. So he was actually charged with second-degree manslaughter. And I think I explained this last time, but listen, here's the difference between manslaughter and murder, and it's really simple. So it's all about intent. And I've talked about this before, and I put a lot of stock in all the analysis that I do. I put a lot of stock in when it comes to someone's intent. And yes, I get it. I have a bias there. And you may not agree, and it may be even a little bit different than what the law says, but what someone's actual intent is, that plays so much with me. Because if you are doing something, if you have a good intent, if your intent is to go out and to try to help people, but in that situation something goes wrong, my personal opinion is that, well, you should be punished less because you were out there and you were trying to do something good. Because in general, we want decent people to try to do good things. However, if you have an intent to harm someone, if you have an intent to break the law, I don't think we should cut you any fucking slack for that. If you have a bad intent, then I don't think you should get any grace when it comes to the punishment phase. So again, in all of my analysis, I put probably more stock in the idea, in the principle of intent than a lot of people do. That's a bias I have, and at least I'm honest about it. So when it comes to manslaughter and murder, it's kind of where I'm going with this. Manslaughter and murder essentially means you have the intent to kill. So any type of crime where someone dies and the district attorney says they intended to kill this person, that goes down the murder chain, okay? That's the murder chain and intent to kill. Manslaughter is when someone dies from the acts of another person, but there was no intent to kill. Usually it has to do with you being reckless or being negligent or heat of passion, things like that. That's manslaughter. So Daniel Penny was not charged with murder. So even the far left DA, who again always wants to prosecute these types of situations, and not Jordan Neely when he kidnapped a 7-year-old, not really so worried about that, or when he's trying to push people in front of subway cars, not real worried about that, but people who have good intentions, we're going to charge them. So even that DA, who again has no love for people who are trying to do good things in the city, even that DA, Alvin Bragg, has publicly said there was no intent to kill. Like, Daniel Penny was not trying to kill him. That's why he was charged with second-degree manslaughter. Now, second-degree manslaughter in New York City essentially says, when you recklessly cause the death of another person. In other words, when you are aware that your actions present a substantial risk, and that someone could be killed, and essentially you are disregarding that risk. So that's pretty much what he's charged with. I'm going to be just completely honest as I always am, but I think it's reasonable to say that there's a legal analysis and then there's a more political, I'll say maybe like a sociological analysis of this case, where the legal analysis, okay, what does the actual statute say? What are the elements? And we compare that against the facts of the case. If you look at that, I get that there's manslaughter charges, okay? Because Daniel Penny did something. He did not intend to kill Jordan Neely, but Jordan Neely died. That's pretty much, textbook manslaughter. So at least when it comes to the elements that are charged, I'm not saying I agree with it or that I want there to be charges filed. Of course not. But what I'm saying is that, I understand the charges being filed. I wrote an article about this case over on my Substack over at Police Law Newsletter before charges were being filed. And I said pretty much the same thing, that I wouldn't be surprised if manslaughter charges are filed, because based on the facts and the letter of the law, I get it. I understand that. But that's different than what I want to happen. So even though I understand why those charges are filed, I do not want Daniel Penny to be found guilty. If he is found guilty, I hope that he gets probation and he never serves a day in jail. Again, because this is one of those cases where, I think we have to look at, it's like either you support the man who was threatening to kill strangers on the subway, or you support the man who made sure that he didn't. This case really is that simple. I want to hear your comments. Let's see what everybody has been saying about this case. Steve Ladner says, if a grand jury indictment doesn't mean it. Oh, Steve always asks his grand jury question. Let's see. Shadow says, I don't think any part of the system has been particularly trustworthy these last few years. That's fair. Sergeant George says, you got to hate it when there's a certain DA who decides suddenly to press charges against people who do good things. I agree. Bing says, I only meant to bring him to the brink of death, Your Honor. I'm going to get that here in a second, Bing. Jorik says, he did nothing wrong. He did a public service for everyone. And that's why I say there's a lot of division on this case. So here's where I think a lot of so again, when it comes to what's going to be on Fox News and what's going to be on CNN and MSNBC, well, listen, when you have AOC saying that this was a lynching, now, obviously that's ridiculous, and people like me who try to be more center and try to be reasonable about things, again, try to be reasonable, even though I obviously support Daniel Penny. I don't want him to be convicted, but on the same side, I'm saying, I get why charges are filed. So I try to be reasonable and in the middle. But when you have people like AOC, before the autopsy has even been released, before charges are filed, she said that this was a lynching. A lynching is an intentional killing based on race. So, first of all, this has nothing to do with race. This has 100% to do with behavior. Let's put it this way. There's certainly no evidence of any kind that this had anything to do with race. So, lacking that evidence, AOC says that this was a lynching, again, an intentional murder, not manslaughter, an intentional murder based on race. So, when people on the left or people are saying that kind of stuff, that's only going to trigger people on the right to say things who just said it there? Bing did, or someone else. No, so someone else said. Jorik says that that they did a public service. So I don't think I don't think anyone actually believes that this was a public service. No one wanted Mr. Neely to die. But when you have that rhetoric that's so far on one side saying it was a lynching, you have to expect the other side to also be equally as ridiculous and extreme on the other side. And listen, the truth is probably in the middle. And I think most reasonable people, which is probably about 80% of us. So there's 10% of people who hate cops, who hate the military, who are just don't like any of this, who are just so far gone, you can't even have a conversation with these people. And there's people on the right, there's 10% of people on the right that are also just nuts, and you can't talk to them either. But 80% of us, in one way or another, are probably in the middle. And here's where most reasonable people can probably find some common ground on this case. They can probably find that a couple different things are probably true. First, that Jordan Neely did threaten people on the subway because it was a container where people weren't allowed to leave, that it was reasonable for some citizens to step in to stop that or prevent that. I think most people can get there. Also, I think most people can say, but Jordan Neely didn't deserve to die. Certainly, that wasn't Mr. Penny's intent to kill him. But again, when you're in a use of force, when you are fighting with someone, when you are using different techniques, nothing is perfect. Nothing goes as it should. This isn't training in a controlled environment. And yes, things don't always go as planned. So I think most of us can get there. That yes, no one the initial takedown, the initial submission, the idea, the principle, the philosophy of taking this guy down and holding him until the next subway stop, until the police come in, most people can get on board and say, yeah, okay, I get why that happened. And that same group of people can also say, I wish he wouldn't have died, or he shouldn't have died, or I wish this would have gone a different way where Mr. Neely wasn't killed. I think most people can get there. Again, the 10% extreme on either side, and that's all you're going to see on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC are the extremes when, again, honestly, most people are in the middle on this case. And I just hope that these people, these 80% that are in the middle, do really think about what I say about intent, where it's like Daniel Penny entered the subway with the intent to go about his day, ride the subway, and go visit his father. Jordan Neely had the intent to terrorize random people on the subway. Those two aren't equal. They're not. And we shouldn't pretend that they are. Let's see if we got a couple other comments on this. Sergeant George says, between race and mental illness, which element do you think will come out on top? I think both. Sergeant George is a really good question. I think when it comes to race, I think we're so far apart on some of these racial issues. Not 80% of the people in the middle, but the people on the extremes are so far apart on race. I don't think we're going to get anywhere. But what I think could happen is there should be a conversation about mental health. Eric Adams, a Democrat mayor from New York City, but he is a former police commander. He said one of the things that Democrats hadn't said for a while, that, when it comes to people who are homeless, mentally ill, and violent, and who have grave passive neglect, meaning that they're so mentally ill, they literally can't take care of themselves. There are all kinds of lawsuits over the last 20 years by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which basically said that being homeless, being crazy, being out of your mind on the street, that's not against the law, and police officers and doctors and governments shouldn't be able to control people, just let people do whatever they want. So that's been the position of the ACLU. I appreciate that, but this is the result of that. So when Eric Adams, he did say when he first came into office that, so what police officers and doctors and police officers and doctors and psychologists what they need in order to basically involuntary make someone go either get mental health treatment or to get on medication. What they need to do that shouldn't be such a high bar, because now the bar is pretty much, unless you are actively threatening someone or threatening yourself and there's some mental illness component, unless that is occurring in the moment, not last week, not 2 hours ago, but unless that is occurring in the moment, doctors and police officers literally can't do anything to get people help. That's what the ACLU wants. That's what they fought for. That's what they've sued over and pretty much got all kinds of courts to agree. But like I said, Eric Adams said even before this that he thinks it should be a little bit easier for police officers and doctors to get people help. It's not compassionate to allow people to be completely out of their minds, not medicated, living on the streets. That isn't compassionate, not only for those people, but for the rest of us, for regular, normal people who just want to go about their day on the subway. It's not compassionate for them either. All right, a couple more questions. Shadow says he may have been having a psychotic break. Maybe the real question is, why was Neely not receiving some kind of care? Good question, Shadow Ben. Yeah, no, I agree. And what I found out, I think a lot of people found out, Shadow, is that New York City, for some reason, has a list of the top 50 people who are mentally ill, violent, have criminal histories, and need help. Kind of in that huge column. 50 people. What are there? I don't know. What are there? 9 million people in New York City, 7 million people in New York City. He was in the top 50. So he was on people's radar. So I agree. This is why I said earlier that, if we look at this from a big structural look at this situation, and knowing that this isn't just Jordan Neely, that there's thousands of people like him, that how do we solve this? That Daniel Penny, listen, I get he's going to be prosecuted. I hope he's not convicted, but Daniel Penny's not the problem. You could throw Daniel Penny in jail for the rest of his life, and you're going to have the exact same problem with thousands of other crazy homeless people who are mentally ill and violent on the New York City subway system. So again, Daniel Penny, not the problem. Jordan Neely and people like him who just go around terrorizing people, again, because they're mentally ill, not medicated. This problem isn't going to be solved unless people in government, lawmakers, advocates, unless they start taking it seriously instead of just trying to profit off when these people get killed every now and then. All right, well, a couple more. Jork says Daniel Penny should be awarded for keeping public order rather than being punished. I can sign on to that. Yeah, I agree 100%. Let's see. 6 Cents says he could have let him go sooner, but that's the only thing I think should have been different. 6 Cents. Yeah, no, I think, you know what? I agree. Again, I'm not sure. I think he held him in that position for from what I know, I was never in the military. I have police experience and legal experience and education, but no military experience. My understanding is that Marines are kind of like the police, though, where they are taught and trained to neutralize the threat and keep the threat from coming back. So would there have been a way where they would be able to restrain him without killing him? Obviously, that's what I would prefer, but I get Penny getting involved in the first place. Let's see. I am legal. Okay, see if it is criminal that he was on the streets, free to terrorize on the subway. It's too late for mental intervention, and restraint was absolutely called for in the situation. Legal. I'm legal. I agree with you 100%. I think I agree with you 100% there. That makes complete sense. And again, once you're in a locked container with someone, you're not in Central Park. You're not in a public library. You're not at a restaurant where you could just, all right, there's a crazy asshole over here. I'm going to get up and walk away. Not an option. Not an option when you're stuck on a subway car, an airplane, or an elevator with someone who's threatening people. Don't have the option to just walk away and leave. And like I said, you're either people. It's really going to be interesting to see where people fall on this particular case. And I think you're really going to find out who some people are, because again, you're either going to support the person who was threatening to kill people on the subway, or you're going to support the person who made sure he didn't. I mean, this case is really that simple. All right, next case that we're going to talk about. So this is a weird one. I don't know if anybody saw. I did a video on it. I did a video on it earlier today. I saw it over the last couple days. But this body camera video, dash camera video, is absolutely nuts. Steve Ladner, hang on. You have police and legal experience, but you can't or won't answer my simple question. Steve, I've answered it a couple times, though you just do not like my answer. I think I've actually typed it out for you as well in one of the chats, Steve. But I appreciate you being here. So this case happened back in March of 21 in Carroll, Iowa. The reason I'm talking about it now is because the body cam footage and the dash cam footage just came out now. Different states have different body cam laws, and you know me, I've said this about 100 different times that I want not just because we have a body camera channel here, but I want body camera footage to come out really as quickly as soon as possible, not just for government transparency, but because I'm nosy. I want to know what happened. I'm fucking interested in all of these different cases. So this case that happened in Carroll, Iowa, really a strange case. March of 21. Again, the body camera video is nuts. So here's what happened. There was a traffic stop. Officer Patrick McCarty did a traffic stop on a vehicle. The vehicle was driven by someone and then had a passenger. The passenger of that vehicle his name is Dennis Geider Jr. So during contact with the driver and with the passenger, the police officer found out that Mr. Geider had a warrant out for his arrest out of Illinois. So just like a normal again, a warrant is an order from a judge. Police officers. So not only is a warrant an order from a judge, but most of the time, police departments have policies that say either specifically police officers, there's no discretion on warrants. Like you have to take someone to jail. You can't just let someone go because you're feeling lazy or you don't feel like it. Or police department policies say something like you have to follow all laws, which, doing that is taking people to jail for warrants as part of that. I guess what I'm getting at is when someone has a warrant, it really isn't the police officer being nice or being a jerk. Like the police officer has to take the person to jail. I mean, that's just one of those things. Typically, and I should also point out that typically warrants aren't extraditable between states unless it's a felony. So what happens? Let's say you're in New Mexico and you get a warrant for you get a ticket for littering and you don't show up. Okay, and then so a judge issues a warrant. Let's say you move to Maine or New Hampshire or Illinois or somewhere else. So and let's say an Illinois police officer stops you. Well, that's 1,300 miles away from New Mexico. So let's say an Illinois police officer stops you, they run your name and shit, and they find out that you have a warrant out of New Mexico. Now, that's either going to be extraditable or not extraditable, meaning that if the state of New Mexico really wants you back, they have to pay for not only for you to be in custody, they have to pay for your transport. Sometimes they have to send agents fucking 1,300 miles away in order to bring your ass back. So most of the time, states only extradite people who have serious felonies, right? Because it wouldn't make sense for a state or a government to put all these resources in to try to prosecute someone for littering. Also, and they don't say this, what municipalities and states think is like, okay, this guy, he had littering, he had a warrant, if he wants to go and live in another state to avoid this, fuck, that's where we want him. We don't want him back in New Mexico. We don't want him back in Arizona. We want him to stay fucking 1,000 miles away, right? So it's reasonable. So it's important to know that this warrant was from a different state. This happened in Iowa, and the warrant was from Illinois. Now, those two states do border each other, but still, it was from a different state. So it's reasonable to believe that it was a felony warrant. So with this warrant, the police officer McCarty told Mr. Geider that to step out of the car. He gave him a lawful and reasonable command. He wasn't a jerk. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't yelling at him. He told him. He said, "Hey, step out of the car. Place your hands behind your back." So Mr. Geider, instead of just cooperating with the police officer, just utilizing basic human decency. Instead of doing that, he did the exact opposite. So what Mr. Geider did is, again, he was in the passenger seat, right? So there was someone who was in the driver's seat. He turns to the driver and he says something to him. You can't hear it because of the body camera. You can't hear it, but he says something to the driver. At that point, Mr. Geider pushes the guy. The driver's side door opens. Mr. Geider pushes the driver out of the car. He then hops into the driver's seat. So now we have someone who had a warrant, who isn't cooperating with the police officer, who literally just went from the passenger seat to the driver's seat. What do you think this guy's intending to do? Like, this doesn't take a rocket scientist. This doesn't take a cop with a law degree to figure out, okay, he's probably gonna drive away, right? He has a warrant. He doesn't want to go to jail. He got in the driver's seat of the car. He's probably going to drive the car away, right? That's a reasonable thing to do. So a good question. I always talk about decision points. point. So when a case happens, what's a decision point? Like, what is happening in the moment where we say, okay, this is the exact point where a police officer did this, but because of law, policy, training, the officer should have done something different. This is one of those decision points. So now the officer has a decision. Someone with a warrant just got into the driver's seat of a car. He's probably going to drive away. What's my action? What should I do? Well, with this police officer, I can tell you what I think the police officer should have done. It's not what the officer did. What the officer did is he actually went around to the front of the car. He drew out, he pulled out his handgun, and he stood in front of the car. Again, that was probably going to start moving. He gets in front of the car. He points his handgun at the individual, at Mr. Geider in the driver's seat, and starts yelling the same kind of commands that you would expect. Get out of the car, show me your hands, don't drive the car, turn off the car, stop the car. All those things that you can imagine a police officer would say in a situation like that. So I should just say that it's hopefully I don't offend anybody by saying this, but listen, it's a bad idea to stand in front of a car that's going to be moving. This is what is considered officer-induced jeopardy, okay? Typically, if a police officer is on the side of a road and a car starts moving towards them and there's nothing they can do and they end up shooting at the car, well, that's typically justified. Because again, the officer can't really do anything. But police officers, per law and per department policy, use of force training and stuff, typically can't position themselves in front of a moving car. And then when the car moves, shoot and say, oh, I was in fear for my safety, because you shouldn't have put yourself there in the first place. Anyways, the officer puts himself in front of the car, draws out, starts giving commands, then the car starts to move forward. So again, even if the officer makes, and I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say, for lack of a better term, a bad decision to stand, just really a strange tactical decision to stand in front of the car starts moving. It didn't accelerate like 0 to 60 in 2 seconds or anything like that, but it starts to move forward slowly towards the police officer, who's maybe 5-10 feet away or so. At that point, it would be a good idea for the police officer, okay, I fucked up, I stood in front of the car, shouldn't have done that. Well, now I'm going to move. Now what the officer does, he jumps on the hood of the car. So the police officer jumps on the hood of the car, and he's grabbing, he still has his handgun out, pointed at the driver, still screaming and yelling on the hood of the car. Well, that doesn't deter Mr. Geider either. And yes, just because the police officer is making some odd, strange, weird, and unsafe tactical decisions, there's no excuse for Mr. Geider to be doing this at this point either. So that is 100. We could say that what the police officer did is against policy and against common sense. I get it. But what Mr. Geider did is like 100% absolutely illegal. So again, intent. Yes, I don't want police officers to violate policy and training. That's not good. But it is not the same thing as committing a felony. Like, it just isn't. It'd be weird to say that it is. So as the police officer is on the hood of the car is moving kind of slow. At that point, the officer doesn't jump off where he probably wouldn't get injured. He hangs on. The car starts to go, speed away. Speeds reach 60 miles an hour. Like, that's crazy. Think about that. 60 miles an hour, and the police officer's trying to hang on to the hood. He ends up on top of the car. It's actually captured on the dash cam video from another police officer, and the body cam video is wild. Eventually, before I even tell you what happens, I'm sure you know that eventually the officer gets thrown off the car. He did survive, which is good, important. He does survive, but he broke his back. So he was thrown off the car. Again, it went down a ditch at 60 miles an hour, and the officer got thrown off. As he's laying there in the ditch with a broken back, he's talking, and as the other police officer runs up to him, he says something to the effect of, "I'm okay, go and get him." So, this guy, at least, I can question his tactics, but I'm not going to question his heart, okay? Because, goddamn, like, this guy, here he is laying with a broken back, and he gets help from a police officer. His first thing is, "Hey, stay here with me, help me up, call me rescue." His first thing is to say, "Go and get him," and he gives the officer directions to go get him. Anyways, Mr. Geider was arrested. Case went to trial, and a lot of people are saying that there should have been more. Mr. Geider, they did avoid trial. Mr. Geider actually just pled guilty to serious injury by vehicle. He's facing up to 5 years in prison. So talking with people on some other platforms in the chats, they're saying, well, this should be attempted murder. This should be, it should be a lot more than 5 years. Yes, I get it, but it was a plea deal. So yes, the state, they could have taken this case to trial, tried to charge attempted murder or aggravated battery or aggravated assault or all of these other crazy felonies, which probably have, 10 to 15 years, as a maximum in prison. But that would be a trial. For whatever reason, the decision was made to not do a trial and to do a plea deal, this is what the plea deal was. Now, I haven't verified this independently, but my guess, and I know this is, again, I'm going to go out on a limb, is that this isn't the only criminal case that Mr. Guider is facing. So my guess is that there are other cases that he's looking at. Listen, if you are going to drive away at 60 miles an hour with a police officer on your car and you're an adult man, it's probably not your first rodeo. You're probably running away from some pretty bad shit. So my guess is this 5 years for this case isn't all that this guy is going to do. And if he is facing 10, 15, 12, 20 years in a different state or for different charges, it really, I get that the reason that this was pled. So again, I understand that. I think there's probably a reason for it. Again, so when I know I was laughing a little bit about the officer, I'm glad that he's okay. But the tactics are absolutely terrible. Again, it's called officer-induced jeopardy. Police officers typically cannot put themselves in a situation that is unnecessarily dangerous. Now, that's not everything. That's not, well, an officer conducted a legal traffic stop and so that was putting themselves in jeopardy because they didn't have to make that traffic stop. No, that's not how it works. If an officer is following policy, training, and law, yes, sometimes they might do things that are dangerous, but if they follow those things, they're generally okay, at least in the eyes of, being at least in the eyes of the court, because they're doing things, they're in a space where they are doing things that are reasonable and legal. This was not reasonable. This is not reasonable. So what the police officer should have done is still give commands and, go behind the car, make sure you have the license plate, which you already do. So you have the license plate, right? And you have the identity of the driver. So what you can do as a police officer at that point, you can go ahead and issue another warrant. So you could write it up. You could say, we stopped him for this traffic. He wasn't the driver, but he didn't listen to the police officer. He didn't listen to the police officer. He evaded arrest. All of the different charges, and then issue a warrant out of Iowa as well. That way, you have a warrant out of Iowa as well. It's not worth your life trying to take someone in for a warrant. It doesn't make any sense. This is pretty much like the other guy's school of policing, jumping on the car, from The Rock and Samuel L. Jackson. That's pretty much what this is like. It's absolutely crazy. Don't understand it. Really curious to see what other people's comments are on this. So 6 Cents says, some cops intentionally step in front of a car just so they can use deadly force. I think it's 100% irresponsible, and it's not like someone won't try it at some point. Yeah, 6 Cents. So that's an interesting comment, and you know what? I'm going to say that has happened before, because the reason it's happened before is because most police departments have a use of force policy. In that use of force policy, they have things that police officers can't do. One of them is shoot at a moving vehicle if you put yourself in there. So this typically is addressed by law and by policy. We don't want police officers to do that. 6 Cents. So like I said, there's an example of, if a police officer is on a traffic stop on the side of the road, kind of doing their thing, minding their own business, and through no fault of their own, another vehicle comes bearing down on them. That's a situation where police officers are going to be covered by policy and law and training to shoot at that vehicle, at the driver, if it's the only thing that's going to save their life. That's different than, okay, someone's in a car, they're about to drive away, and I step purposely into the middle. So we don't want police officers to do that. Again, there are laws and policies around that. It's called officer-induced jeopardy. So we don't want officers to do that. I don't think it happens all that often. But again, even in situations like that, you still have a bad guy, a criminal, who is trying to run over a police officer or doesn't care if they run into a police officer, which is a serious felony. So again, what I like to say is that these things aren't equal. Yes, we look at so police officers might be violating policy. They might be doing something that isn't great tactically. That's bad. I don't want officers to do that. The other thing is you're trying to run someone over and kill them. That's a violent felony. They're not equal, right? They aren't equal. The intent isn't the same. Let's see. Steve says, in San Antonio, Texas, the cop could shoot him running away, and the DA will disregard a grand jury indictment. We have Tennessee versus Gardner. That's still good law. So police officers are able to shoot and kill violent fleeing felons if they are able to articulate that the individual is that someone else's life is in danger of either dying or will be the victim of great bodily injury. So yeah, Tennessee versus Garner, that is Supreme Court law that is recognized anywhere because it's a Supreme Court. So Sixth Sense says, kind of had to say I didn't see the cop on my hood right in front of me. Yeah, it would be strange. It would be strange if he said he didn't see him. So in what Mr. Guider did say, and obviously this is bullshit, but what he said is that he was afraid because the cop was pointing his gun. That's why he did that. Well, I'm just going to point out that the active resistance, the not listening to the police officer, that happened way before the cop, and this is all on body cam video, that's how I'm saying it. That happened way before the police officer told him to exit. So when the police officer told him to exit the car during the initial contact, the officer was nice, friendly, polite, did not have any weapons drawn. No gun, no taser, nothing was in the police officer's hand. He asked him, didn't demand, didn't scream, didn't yell. He asked him nicely and politely to step out of the vehicle. It was at that point, no guns were drawn. It was at that point that Mr. Guider went from the passenger seat to the driver's seat, and obviously had the intent that he was going to flee. So Mr. Guider's excuse of I was afraid, I acted like this because the cop pulled a gun on me, again, it's bullshit, because the active resistance, the idea to flee the scene in the car happened way before a police officer had his gun drawn. Let's see. I Am Legal says the cop made a foolish, agree. Cop made a foolish, out of policy, spur of the moment decision. He would probably make a different decision 9 times out of 10. This does nothing to diminish the driver's liability. Agree 100%. Thank you. I Am Legal OKC. I have to follow you because you're saying all the things. I agree with that. Yeah. Again, we don't want police to make tactical errors. We don't want them to. We want cops to follow training, policy, and law. We don't want cops to make tactical errors. But if a police officer makes a boneheaded tactical error in the moment, that is not the same. That is not equal to someone committing a violent felony. Like, it's just not. Again, to pretend that these two things are equal is a little silly. Sergeant George says, this is what having poor situational awareness can culminate in. Oh, I agree 100%. Thank you, Sergeant George. Yeah, that is 100% correct. And I also agree on Legal OKC is that, yeah, if the police officer had to do it again, if there was 20/20 hindsight, you're right. I don't think he would have done this. It was probably just a spur of the moment that here you are, you're in a situation, it happens, and you just act and you just react. And police officers, a lot of the time, they have it in their heads because they want to do good. They want to help people. They want to take bad guys to jail. And when situations like this happen, sometimes they don't have the time to think. So I'm just going to say, like, if that police officer was in a training, let's say I was doing a training for police officers in Carroll, Iowa, which I'm never going to do. But let's say I was, and I asked every police officer in there, hey, I want everyone to come up and give me a 30-second small presentation on what you would do in this situation. My guess is that exact police officer, Officer McCarty, he would not say, well, you go in front and then you jump on the hood and then you hold on like this. Like, there's no way he would say that, right? So he knows, intellectually he knows he made a wrong decision in the moment, and I'm glad he's still alive. I think, therefore I am. How do you feel about laws in states that allow a person to be charged with murder when they do not directly cause the murder? Let's see. That's an interesting question. So I think you need to be more specific. If you have a specific case, I can look into it. I think what you might be referring, is a person breaking into a house with a friend. Friend gets killed by cops. DA charges the first guy with murder. Oh, that's a good question. That's where I thought you were going. So what I think, therefore I am, is asking is about felony murder. So here's what felony murder is. Felony murder is essentially there has to be a conspiracy of multiple people to commit a felony, not just any felony. So not like embezzlement, not like shoplifting or embezzlement or a wire fraud or anything like that. Okay. But it's in every state, it basically lists the ones that are going to be in the category where someone could be charged with felony murder. One of them in literally every state is going to be armed robbery. So let's go ahead and say that. So let's say 3 or 4 people, their goal is to do an armed robbery. One person is going to be the getaway driver. One person is going to be the lookout. One person is going to make sure that things are safe for the bad guys inside. And then the 4th person is going to be the one who actually tells the teller, who tells the teller or the bank manager to give them the money. Maybe they're the ones who have the firearm, or maybe they're the ones who. So all 4 people are in on it. Now let's say the intent wasn't to kill anyone, but the intent was to commit a felony that is in this category of felonies. So let's say the individual who hands the teller the note or demands the money from the bank teller. Let's say someone resists, and that person, that one bad guy, ends up shooting and killing a bank teller or one of the customers who steps in or something. Now you have the lookout, the getaway driver, and the other person who is in the bank, the three other accomplices. So they had nothing to do with the murder. They didn't pull the trigger. They probably weren't even armed, but they're also charged with murder as well. That's the legal theory of felony murder. I like it. Here's why I like it, because what it does is it discourages people from being in conspiracies to commit violent felonies. I like that. I think that's a good idea. I'm good with it. If you say to yourselves, hey, the four of us, we are going to best thing I can say is I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good legal theory. Again, it shouldn't be for every felony. It shouldn't be for embezzlement or wire fraud or mortgage fraud or anything like that or anything like that. But yeah, violent felony, when groups of people get together and they're going to commit a violent felony, and someone dies during the commission of that violent felony, I'm 100% good with felony murder. Let's see. I Am Legal says if you have the intent to commit a crime that might result in injury or death, you're culpable. In fact, that it does have a bad result. Yeah, I agree. I'm 100% good with that. Sergeant George says, Sergeant George knows that's the felony murder rule. And I Am Legal OKC says it's usually a question of foreseeability. It feels like I'm in law school again. I Am Legal. I graduated in 2019, so I've been out of law school for a little bit. But yeah, foreseeability, that is 100% exactly correct. All right, the last case that I'm going to talk about, this is one of those things where this is a small town in New Mexico called Farmington, New Mexico. I covered a case in Farmington a couple weeks ago, I think Farmington, New Mexico has probably 50 to 70,000 people. There's probably 100 cops, 80 cops or so. Smaller police department. It's really close to Southwest Colorado. Northern New Mexico looks like Southwest Colorado. It's beautiful out there. It's an oil town. Blue collar workers. It's a good place. It's the 30 minutes from the Colorado border. Again, absolutely beautiful out there. It's also near the Four Corners area. Native American tribes surround it. It's by the Four Corners area. Really cool part of the country. I've been there a whole bunch. And but it's a smaller town. So if I say, hey, the case in Farmington, New Mexico, typically you wouldn't have to say which fucking case in Farmington, New Mexico, because there's been two. So the first one was a couple weeks ago with Robert Dotson, the 52-year-old who police officer. You remember this? Police officers rang the doorbell. They rang the doorbell of the wrong house across the street from the domestic violence call. Some guy opens the door like he's in SEAL Team 6 and points a gun at police officers for absolutely no reason. Police officers reasonably respond and kill him. That was in Farmington, New Mexico. So this case actually happened earlier this week. It involved a teen gunman, 18-year-old teen gunman who was actually slighted or scheduled to graduate from high school the very next day. His name is Bo Wilson. What he did is he armed himself with 3 guns. One of them he purchased legally right after he turned 18. 2 of them, I believe, were family guns. He also had over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He did have on he had some mentally ill. He had some mental illness issues. I believe he also had body armor on as well. At least at the beginning, what he did is he left his house and he started to roam around his neighborhood. And the chief of police, Steve Hebby, I believe that's how you pronounce it in Farmington. Chief of police said that essentially what Mr. Wilson did is he started shooting at essentially everything he could. What he did is he was shooting at or into houses in his neighborhood. He started to shoot at cars that were driving down the street. The first one he did, the first car he shot at was being driven by a 79-year-old woman. She was shot as she was driving down his residential streets. 2 other women, elderly women, a 98-year-old and her 73-year-old daughter, saw this happen, saw the 79-year-old woman needing help. They actually went to assist her because she was laying in the street after being shot. They went to assist her. They were killed as well. In total, he shot 9 people. The response from police, I think it's important to talk about a police response to active shooters because officers, we want police to have a certain kind of response. We want police officers to have what I call an anti-Uvalde response, and that's exactly what they did. Police got the call. They got on scene quick. Not only Farmington police, but New Mexico State Police, other smaller agencies. As soon as there was gunfire, they were on the scene quick. Two officers, as they responded and engaged, the subject. Two police officers were shot. Both of them survived. There was a state police officer whose name is Andreas Stamatiadis. He actually drove himself to the hospital after he was wounded, which is pretty badass. Farmington Police Sergeant Rachel DeSenza, she was also shot as she responded and was engaging the gunman. Police officers thankfully did kill the gunman, but again, 2 police officers were shot. 9 people were shot total. 3 were killed. That was in Farmington, New Mexico. The police officers, at least as of this morning, I'm going to say that the Farmington Chief of Police Steve Hebby, he has done an excellent job of really just informing the public about what's going on and answering questions, not like a politician, but like a human. If you ever get the chance to watch one of his press conferences, he does an absolute brilliant job of letting people in the community know exactly what's going on. But he basically said that they're still working on a motive. They're not really sure what the motive is. The family of this kid was horrified. Again, I wish they would have been a little more proactive beforehand instead of being horrified afterwards. They did hire an attorney, obviously, or a spokesperson, and they did give a statement where essentially what they said is that obviously that they gave their condolences to the families who were affected, the people who were shot and killed and injured. They said that Bo was suffering from mental illness, and that's really all they said, is that he had mental health problems. So the question that I want to ask is, I'm a Second Amendment guy, I absolutely am, but he's still living in your house. I get he's 18, I get he can purchase firearms, I get it, but he's living in your house. If you know he has a history, a problem with mental illness, how in the world does anybody, this is a question, how do you allow someone to have a firearm in your house knowing that they have mental health problems? Not only a firearm that they purchased, but at least, again, I could be proved wrong later on, but at least what we're hearing right now is that he purchased one of the firearms and the other 2 that he was armed with were actually firearms from the family. So I'm gonna speculate a little bit, but if there are family firearms that he had possession of, either they weren't locked up or he was able to get into wherever they were locked. That seems unbelievably and incredibly irresponsible. Okay, let's see if we have any comments on that particular case. Let's see. I Am Legal says, how do you spell 3 guns, 1,000 rounds of ammo, threat to commit murder, suicide by cop? Yeah, that's exactly what this was. 6 Cents says, nice to know there are people in the chat that actually know the law. Very cool indeed. 6 Cents, I agree as well. That's one of the reasons why I really like doing the show live, is the people who join in the show are really ask good questions, and a lot of times, even more so than asking good questions, have really good answers and comments for some of these things. So just so you know, after this case, other things in New Mexico, but the governor of New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, wants to call a special session to make stronger gun laws. And I'm just going to ask the question that I think people should be asking their lawmakers, not just in New Mexico, because this is happening in a lot of places. What gun law could have been in effect that would have prevented this? If you could give me that answer, don't just say we want stronger gun laws. Again, that's very general. That's just like saying we want stronger drug laws. Again, to me, that isn't that interesting. Tell me what you want to do. Tell me what the exact law is, and then reasonable and honest people on both sides should be able to ask questions and really dive deep into these really important issues. But I'm not sure what stronger gun law would have prevented this in the first place. Now, parents who own a house, who have a kid who's living under their roof, yeah, that's your house. You are in control. You don't have to worry about the Constitution. You don't have to worry about any of that shit. You are the parents. You are in charge. You are the owners of that home. You have fucking domain over what happens inside that house. So if anything, I'm going to say that my opinion is, if anything, it's that's where the enforcement have to be. Individuals controlling what happens inside of their own house. I think it's more difficult on a larger level for governments to do it, but I'm open to suggestions. So I'm not saying I don't want stronger gun laws. I'm saying I just want to know what the idea is. Tell me what the idea is. I said stronger gun laws, it's kind of like a vague philosophy, and it's not very interesting because I don't know what that means. Tell me what the law is, is. Let's see what it is, and tell me based on research what you think that law is actually going to do. Let's have that conversation. I think we should all be willing to have that conversation, not just on guns, but on all kinds of issues. All right, one more comment, and then we're going to take off for the day. Let's see. I am legal says my very first visit to your channel, but not my last for sure. An actual intelligent discussion. That's what we're all about. I am legal OKC. Really enjoyed your comments. Please make sure that you subscribe. Obviously, let's see. Steve says we would already have been loaded onto train cars if this nation was not armed. Yeah. So Steve, I agree. Again, I preface this by saying that I'm a pretty strong Second Amendment guy. I'm trying to be reasonable and honest and saying that I lean towards that I don't think any stronger gun laws would have fixed this. So that's my bias. That's my, not even a bias, like that's my position on it. But I want to hear the discussion. I would like to hear both sides. I would like to hear the other side say, hey, this is the law that we want. This is what we think it will do. It's in line with the Constitution because of these cases. Like, give me that, and then let's look at that and have a reasonable conversation. I'm all up to have the discussion and the debates, but again, in general, I'm far more pro Second Amendment than a lot of people might be, especially compared to Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor of New Mexico. Okay, all right, that's going to be it. 6 cents. Have a good one. All right, so that's going to be it for today. I really appreciate everybody coming into the show. Again, we had a really good discussion. Really like the comments. Just so you know, as the week goes on, if you do leave comments or you have cases or questions or things you want me to cover next week, definitely put it in the chat. I do go ahead and check it pretty much all week long. So if there is something in there, definitely do that. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do that. And almost more importantly than that, share it with your friends on your social media accounts so we can get as many people in here as possible. And again, my name is Daniel. You can go ahead and follow me everywhere over at Police Law News. I hope everyone has a great weekend and stay safe.